Hello everyone, my name is Nathan Fair. You're about to watch a round analysis of the final NSDA round of Lincoln Douglas with the national champion Joe and the runner-up in Lincoln Douglas, Shreyaa. You're about to see them break down the round, but before you do, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps out a ton, and you can get more videos like this. If you're into public forum, I have a video for that and a bunch of other stuff. Enjoy the video. Thanks for watching.
I affirm resolved. The intergenerational accumulation of wealth is antithetical to democracy. For clarity of debate, I provide the following definition. Intergenerational, being or occurring between generations. Wealth, monetary measure which includes the sum of natural, human, and physical assets. Antithetical, very different from and in opposition to someone or something. Democracy, a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation. My value is equality. Baumüller 7 writes that the political, legal, and moral equality of every citizen is a fundamental value of democracy. Among the most important forms of democratic equality to be guaranteed by the equal protection of the laws is equality of opportunity. This means that the law must not unfairly disenfranchise anyone in their opportunity to seek a variety of social goods, such as education, employment, housing, and political rights. Therefore, a society that creates unequal opportunity based on nothing but initial conditions is directly opposed to the ideals of democratic fairness. My criterion is John Rawls' theory of justice. Miller 11 writes that Rawls argues in his original position that people would agree on two basic principles as a way to structure society. The first should be equality in the way basic rights and duties are assigned. And the second would be to arrange social and economic inequalities so that they are both A, the greatest benefit of the least advantaged, and B, attached to offices and positions open to all under the conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Contention 1, political influence. Runic 14 writes that a 2011 study found that the wealthiest 1% of families had inherited an average of $2.7 million from their parents. This was 447 times more money than the least wealthy group. And Congress is far more responsive to the wealthy. Keister 15 writes that in terms of congressional responsiveness to constituents, the preferences of wealthier constituents receive much more attention, especially in the Senate. This has important policy implications, particularly when the preferences of the wealthy and the general public diverge, as they often do. For example, while 87% of the general public supports the idea of spending whatever is necessary to ensure good public schools for all children, just 35% of the wealthy do. But this influence is seen outside the US as well. Albert 18 writes that a group of massive, mostly family-run business conglomerates called the Chaebol dominate South Korea's economy and yield extraordinary influence over its politics. Today, many politicians look to them for financial support during campaigns and often tout their economic successes as national ones. Meanwhile, the Chaebol lobby for favorable legislation and public policy. Critics say the tight-knit relationship between Seoul and the Chaebol have fostered a culture of corruption, in which embezzlement, bribery, and tax evasion have become the standard. Impact. Wealthy conglomerates harm democratic stability. Cool 09 writes that since World War II, many poor but equal countries, such as Costa Rica and India, have successfully established and sustained stable democracy. At the same time, similar but unequal countries like Nigeria, Peru, and Turkey have oscillated between dictatorship and democracy. The difference between these two groups of countries is not in the ability of the latter to create democratic regimes, but rather in their inability to maintain them. The authors conclude that inequality's pernicious role in undermining democratic aspirations, institutions, and rules is the greatest threat facing democracy in the Americas today. Contention 2. The wealthy use their influence to deny others wealth-building opportunities. Cage et al. 18 writes that most of the wealthiest US billionaires are incredibly conservative on economic issues, obsessed with cutting taxes and unenthusiastic about government programs to help with jobs, income, or retirement pensions. The study ferreted out quiet activity by 12 of the wealthiest billionaires, including the Kochs and several wealthy inheritors of the Walton and Mars fortunes, aimed specifically at cutting or abolishing the estate tax. But this influence is replicated outside the US as well. The richest man in Nigeria, Aliko Dangote, has enriched himself at the mercy of the Nigerian people. Castle 19 writes that the business empire he began to build began more than 3 decades ago and is now the largest sector employer in Nigeria. Dangote lived in an upper-class life, with his grandfather once being the richest man in Nigeria himself. And Dangote's influence has been profound. Farwemian 17 writes that a Reuters investigation in June last year found that Dangote's companies had been receiving preferential foreign currency allocations from the central bank at a time when the Nigerian economy had been almost crippled by a dollar shortage. Dangote cements 65% share in the Nigerian market means that it also sets prices for that commodity in the country. and it has used this advantage to generate large profits at the expense of the Nigerian people. Therefore, not only are wealthy voices disproportionately heard by lawmakers, but they can then use their influence to further muzzle the voices of the masses. Contention 3, the racial wealth gap. Subpoint A, intergenerational wealth accumulation harms minority social mobility. Christian 20 writes that inheritances and other intergenerational transfers account for more of the racial wealth gap than any other demographic or socioeconomic indicator. And Sullivan 16 goes on to say that because households of color have less wealth today, Black and Latino young adults are far less likely than young white people to receive any money at all from their family members to make investments in their future. The result is that the racial wealth gap perpetuates from generation to generation with profound implications for economic security and mobility. Subpoint B, breaking up white wealth dynasties is necessary. Dynastic wealth for white families is growing. However, 19 writes that since 1992, the combined wealth of the top 3 families, the Waltons, the Kochs, and the Marses, increased by 5,868%. But more progressive taxation can help mitigate this. Huang and Roderick 19 writes the amount of revenue a tax system raises heavily influences the size of public investments the government can fund, including investments that can help reduce racial inequity. Therefore, if wealth remains in one place, the ability to help minorities remains impossible. It's for the next gross erosion of equality that I urge a strong affirmative ballot. I am now open to cross-ex whenever my opponent is ready.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I will start cross now. What does Rawls specifically have to say about inheritance?
Rawls specifically says that if the original position means that race or class unfairly influences how you're treated in society,
right,
then we have to do equality of opportunity.
Sure, but would you say that Rawls believes that inheritance prevents governments from helping the least well off?
Considering that inheritances are disproportionately skewed towards the white wealthy people, Rawls would say that is not equitable.
Okay, if that's the case, then why in his updated version of the theory of justice, which still aims to help the least well off, did he state that with respect to inheritances, quote, an estate itself need not be subject to tax, nor need the total given by bequest be limited?
Considering that when we're looking to equality of opportunity, Rawls writes specifically that race should not influence the original position. Therefore, if the racial wealth gap persists, we have to
specifically at inheritances and the intergenerational accumulation of wealth, right? And Rawls specifically said in his updated version of a theory of justice that inheritances don't necessarily prevent the least well off from benefiting, right?
But looking at that, okay, that proves one thing. First, you have to prove that inheritances don't hurt the least well off. I articulate to you in contention too that the wealthy are disproportionately using their influence to crush minority wealth.
Fine, let's go to you. So you talk about helping the least advantaged. How do we determine who is the least advantaged in a society?
That's a pretty obvious question. If you are disproportionately poor and can't move up in society, you are the least advantaged.
Okay, so is it solely based on poverty, or is it also based on things like race, which can also lead to social discrimination?
Considering that race is intrinsically tied to poverty due to economic discrimination and intergenerational wealth, it's going to be a myriad of factors.
Okay, if there are all of these factors, then how can we determine who's objectively the least well off? For example, would a Black first-generation college student who is now a successful lawyer be considered less well off than a middle-class white male who has never had to face any discrimination in his life, even though the white male is poorer?
Under my framework, we're looking to equality of opportunity. If either race or class hurts those things, you are going to be considered least well off. If you want a comparative analysis, we'll have to address that later in rebuttals.
Okay, sure. Let's go to your example about Costa Rica and India. You said Costa Rica and India are considered equal but poor, right?
That Pool of 9 card specifically says that unequal countries are significantly less stable, yes.
Okay, so what is the percentage of income inequality in Costa Rica and India? Do you know that?
The card doesn't specify income inequality. It's specifically talking about wealth accumulation and how that actually influences the democratic process.
But you use this Costa Rica and India example to prove that that poverty doesn't really matter as long as there's equality, right? But are Costa Rica and India really equal societies?
Well, what we're seeing is that Costa Rica and India and countries that are significantly less equal are going to be more harmed in the democratic transition. Democracy must only persist if there's a baseline level of equality. That's my framework.
Okay, I'll take that.
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty nervous going into the cross because, first speech of the round and everything. But I think I went for her framework a lot, which I think given the nature of the round was the right thing to do. And at the end, I think if I remember right, I ended up just trying to turn everything under her framework anyways. But at that point in the round, I was kind of trying to win on, like, I was trying to take down her framework so that I could just win under mine. So I think that was like my strategy going into cross-examination. Especially, I really wanted to hit home on the roles thing a lot, just because like her whole framework was predicated on roles. And so I think I wanted to try to prove that roles like specifically took inheritances into account in some of his work, and still found that like inheritances were okay and they don't have to be like, and they're not like harmful to democracy. I think my articulation of those points definitely could have been better. And I think my questions were a little bit long-winded, which I think took away from how powerful they could have been had I just like worded them a little bit differently. Because I think that in the cross, I had all of the right ideas. I just wasn't articulating my thoughts as well as I could have, which I think left the judges a little bit confused, and maybe Joe, I'm not really sure, but.
I mean, there were a couple questions where I was definitely a little bit confused, and my strategy just as a debater is if I don't know exactly what you're fishing for, I'm just going to kind of repeat what the card is and not really answer the question, which is something that a lot of debaters do on cross, which is one of the reasons it's so frustrating. I do think going for the framework was definitely a good idea. We debated in round 0, so like my style was always pretty contention heavy. And I really didn't touch on the framework that much. So I think definitely trying to hit me with roles was a good idea. I thought that line of questioning came out really well with the judges, like when looking at ballots after the round. So I think in terms of articulation, those roles questions were worded really well, and the judges did pick up on that. I know Anthony Berryhill, who's right here in the panel, definitely liked the articulation of roles coming out of both cross and then also in your final voters.
I negate. I value justice defined as giving each their due. The resolution is thus a question of which side best promotes the rights protection democracy strives for, since justice is intended to distribute dues. In order to ensure that people within a democracy receive their dues, the government must be legitimate. Thus, my criterion is promoting governmental legitimacy. In a democratic context, governmental legitimacy is defined by Peter Stillman of Vassar College as the compatibility of results of governmental output with the value patterns of those affected by these results. The value pattern of a society can be characterized by the generalized criteria of desirability, the standards for evaluation, and the priorities of the society. Government officials must respond to the needs and values of the citizens that put them in power. Without a legitimate democracy, there is no proper enforcer of dues, hindering justice. Contention 1, entrepreneurship. The intergenerational accumulation of wealth encourages entrepreneurship and business startups. This is empirically confirmed by Willem of Purdue University. After controlling for income, the study concluded that the recipients of wealth transfers are significantly more likely to start a business compared to those that did not receive a wealth transfer. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is by reducing the barrier to entry. Rosen of Princeton University explained that the lack of access to capital markets creates a barrier for individuals to start up a business. However, Rosen finds that inheritances incentivize business startups by providing the necessary capital. Not only do inheritances provide startup capital, but they also encourage entrepreneurs to take risks. Inheritances provide entrepreneurs something to fall back on if their business has a slow start. This risk-taking increases the probability of creating a successful business. The second way that intergenerational accumulation of wealth encourages entrepreneurship is by allowing family businesses to be passed down. According to the NBCC, family businesses are a strong channel of intergenerational wealth transmission. Family businesses are a form of wealth that can be passed down to heirs, encouraging heirs to learn successful entrepreneurship skills early on. A business that someone starts and wants to pass down to their family members should not be taken away by the state. In any society, innovation can only flourish if the intellectual property and efforts of labor that people produce can rightfully belong to them. And in a democracy where the value of the individual to exercise their agency is paramount, allowing individuals to control what they create is a fundamental extension of liberty and property rights. Thus, intergenerational wealth accumulation encourages entrepreneurship and business startups, strengthening democracy in 2 ways. The first is through job creation and financial stability. The International Labor Organization reports that data gathered in 99 countries found that small businesses together account for 70% of total employment, making them by far the most important drivers of employment. Nasi Mohsen of Louisiana State University finds that decreased unemployment rates strengthen citizen support for and belief in democracy. When citizens are unemployed, they believe the government is incompetent or only exists for the benefit of the elite, so they become more likely to resort to less democratic options. Job creation also empowers the middle class, allowing them to advocate for the protection of their rights. The second reason that small businesses strengthen democracy is because entrepreneurs promote political freedom and embody democratic ideals. According to the Center for International Private Enterprise, entrepreneurship shares core values with democracy: open competition, participation in public life, individual responsibility, serving others, and a preference for finding solutions within the rule of law. Entrepreneurs can reshape the political economy, spark new mindsets and awareness of freedom, and build a constituency for inclusive politics. Entrepreneurship allows democracy to flourish. Now let's go to my opponent's side of the flow. With our value of equality, prefer justice because equality can be achieved without necessarily having a good democracy. For example, if everyone in a society had very little influence over the government, but they had equally little influence, you'd be meeting her value, but that's not necessarily a good society to live in. She talks about equality of opportunity, but there's no way to actually really enforce this because some people are always going to have advantages over others. With our value criterion of theory of justice, couple of responses. One, remember what I showed you in cross-examination about how Rawls specifically says that inheritances don't prevent the least well-off from being helped. Two, she has no weighing mechanism. Three, there's no objective way to determine who the least well-off is in society. And four, there's no bright line as to how far we can go to protect the least advantage. Now, overview of her entire contention level argument. My opponent can't just say it's bad when the top 1% accumulates wealth. She must prove that as a general principle, intergenerational accumulation of wealth is antithetical to democracy, meaning that she also has to prove that it's really bad when the poor receive wealth transfers as well. So let's go on to her contention one. She talks about how the top 1% are inheriting too much wealth, and that's creating inequality. However, one, this is resting upon the fact that intergenerational wealth accumulation leads to inequality, which is false for two reasons. One, Scandinavian countries have no restrictions on intergenerational accumulation of wealth and are the most highly egalitarian democracies in the world. Two, intergenerational accumulation of wealth decreases inequality because even if the rich receive more money, the effect that the money that does go to the poor has on them is far greater. For example, in Kenya, 20% of household escapes from poverty were due to the intergenerational accumulation of wealth. She talks about how these individuals are going to politicians are going to prefer wealthy constituents. You can actually turn this. Corruption is going to be worse in the affirmative world because when the government acts in a way that delegitimizes the intergenerational accumulation of wealth, the rich are actually incentivized to exert their influence in other spheres. She brings up South Korea. However, her South Korea example is based on history, not currency. Not currently. South Korea, since 2019, South Korean judiciaries have been indicting and prosecuting corrupt governmental officials, and Freedom House actually gives South Korea a 4 out of 4 in allowing opposition groups to contest incumbents. South Korea is a new democracy, so just because they're still figuring things out doesn't mean intergenerational accumulation of wealth is antithetical to democracy. And also, politicians aren't just going to look at the wealthy because they want to be reelected, and so they have to look to the majority as well. She talks about in her contention too, she brings up India and Costa Rica. However, the OECD characterizes both of these as highly unequal countries. In her contention too, she talks about denying political influence. Now, the majority of billionaires are conservatives. One, MinPost actually finds for those earning $100,000 or more, 47% vote liberally. Prefer this because we're not just looking at billionaires here, we're looking at the wealthy as a whole. She talks about abolishing the estate tax, but the reason that we haven't abolished the estate tax is because only 1/3 of Americans even want any sort of limit on government, on inheritance. And she talks about Nigeria. However, the issues with Nigeria are based on terrorism, not intergenerational accumulation of wealth. Her contention 3 subpoint A about the racial wealth gap actually turned this because the best way to remedy this is to allow wealthy African Americans to pass down their wealth. Savoy 19 finds that we are in the midst of the largest minority wealth transfer ever. Since 2007, African Americans have been accumulating wealth at a faster rate than whites, and over the next several decades are going to transfer $3.4 trillion in wealth. So the best way to solve for the wealth gap is to actually allow this to happen. With her subpoint B, she talks about white wealth dynasties. Couple of problems here. One, Hill of the Market Watch actually finds that 90% of wealthy people's inheritance is gone by the 3rd generation. That means that we're not actually depleting these, we're actually not going to see these dynasties because most of the wealthy are going to deplete their wealth shares, whereas when the poor receive inheritances, it actually goes to taking them out of poverty. Additionally, inheritances can actually be distributed in an egalitarian manner. This was done in Germany, which significantly decreased social inequality and increased political equality drastically.
Excellent. Can everyone still hear me okay? Thumbs up? Yes? Excellent.
You're good.
Cool. Let's begin cross. So on contention 1, you say that Kenya reduced inequality. Given that Kenya has some of the greatest wealth inequality in the world, how do we have any evidence that these policies actually worked?
Well, I'm saying that when we look to the long term, we can decrease inequality due to the intergenerational accumulation of wealth. I would argue that without the intergenerational accumulation of wealth, the inequality in Kenya would be a lot worse, because what we see here is that the rich, when they receive these inheritances, they often blow it off within 90% of 90% of it off within 3 generations. This makes sense because if you don't actually earn your money, a lot of times, especially if you're rich and you're used to everything being handed to you, you don't necessarily always know what to do with it. Whereas when the poor receive these inheritances, it can actually be used to increase their socioeconomic standing. That's why even if the rich receive more money, it doesn't necessarily matter, because the proportion of the effect that the money that has,
your study that you just cited specifically cites relative wealth inequality, correct?
What do you mean? I mean, which study?
You say that as a percentage of their wealth, Black wealth accumulation is increasing, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so then let's say we had a Black family whose wealth went from 53,000 to 63,000, whereas white wealth went from 7.2 million to 7.6 million. Relative inequality goes down. How is Black social mobility increasing?
Well, I would say that relative inequality isn't going down because the white family's wealth increased by a lot more.
Exactly. Absolute inequality goes up, but as a percentage of the wealth, the Black family is increasing, correct?
Well, no. What I'm saying here with my card about Savoy 19 is that currently, since African Americans are accumulating wealth at a faster rate, so that means that over time, the best way to actually remedy this racial wealth gap is to allow them to pass down this wealth, especially since
okay, let's talk about that now. We're seeing Black capital accumulation in the status quo. How long in your world does it take for the racial wealth gap to close?
Well, I don't think that I have to prove that, I don't think I have to give a specific frame of time. I'm just saying that right now we're seeing this is the first generation of African-American millionaires that we're seeing. And it would be a shame if they were not able to actually pass down their wealth to their heirs so that their heirs do not have to experience the discrimination that they did in maintaining their wealth. I would argue that the best way because the root cause of the racial wealth gap is the racial income gap. So the best way to actually remedy that income gap is to allow African Americans and other minority groups to increase their social standing and provide them with good professions and wealth. And the best way to do that is by allowing the people who have already succeeded to keep passing down their wealth, right? Because at the end of the day, African Americans are finally having these opportunities to pass down their wealth. It's not fair to just take that away from them, because you have to show that as a general racial accumulation of wealth is antithetical to democracy, not just when whites pass it down.
That's fine. Taking running prep, starting now.
Okay.
I think that one thing that I could have definitely done better in this speech was slowing down a little. I think I have a tendency to want to hit everything on the flow, so I talked really fast, and I think some of the judges probably didn't like that it sounded a little bit more like a PF round than an LD round at times, because I was just kind of trying to hit everything on the flow and dumping a lot of cards. I tried to put some logical analysis behind every card that I read, but I do think that I sacrificed presentation a little bit for content. In this round, I didn't have any judges say that that was a horrible thing. Looking back at some of my other ballots, a couple of judges said that I should have focused on presentation a little bit more. I thought that I'd kind of get an excuse from that because it's online, but apparently they still care about, you looking at the camera and stuff, which I didn't really think that anyone would, but so yeah. And then speaking was a little rough for the whole round because I was very, very nervous. And so there was a lot of stuttering, which I think almost stressed me out a little bit more, because when you stutter, you're not getting your content in. And so then when you're not getting your content in, you want to talk faster. And then when you talk faster, you stutter more. And so it's just kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. And then by the end, you're kind of freaking out a little bit. But I think I hit everything that I wanted to in that speech. I just think I should have been a little bit more organized with how I did it.
I do definitely agree. I focused a lot on presentation because I had the oratory and HI background, so that was more kind of intrinsic to my debate. Also, Oregon circuit is really slow. You have a couple people in Northern Oregon who will spread, but it's really, really rare. So, I mean, speed is definitely not something that I normally do. I do think that dumping the cards was actually a pretty good idea. Organization was a little bit iffy, but I mean, one of the things that negative debaters do know is the next affirmative speech is really short and it's really hard to hit everything. So definitely a strategy for neg debaters is if you can dump quite a bit on their case and it makes sense and it has a like pretty cohesive story, like you were tying a lot of things back to roles, I think that's a really good idea, because then you can get up in your next rebuttal speech and just be like, she dropped this, she dropped this, she dropped this. And for flow heavy judges, that works really, really well, because the affirmative is really, really pressed for time in this next speech. One thing I definitely think that I could have done better was push you a little bit more on cross, because I know a strategy for a lot of debaters is to try to just eat time, because cross isn't that long and you have a lot of questions that you can ask them. And I think just trying to push you a little bit more, but walking that fine line between pushing you and not seeming super rude and abrasive was a good thing.
Yeah, I think like I agree. I mean, I think that you definitely had me on one of the questions. I forget. And I was like kind of hoping that you wouldn't push me more on it, and then you didn't. So I was kind of like, okay, thank God. But I think another thing that I wanted to do better, there was a turn that I put on your case, and I should have fleshed it out more, because some of the judges understood it and some of them didn't, which was like totally my fault for not explaining it well. I think it was like the political representation turn, which I said, like, when you're taking inheritances away from the rich, they're more likely to try to exert their influence in other spheres, because like they can't necessarily do it through like passing down their inheritances to their heirs. So maybe they'd be like more likely to like spend that money on politics or something like that. And so I think like in my previous rounds, I had done a better job of explaining that turn, because I wasn't trying to get through, because you had a lot of content in your app that I really wanted to hit. Like you had, there was so much in there. And so I didn't really have that much time to flesh out that particular turn. But I know that for the judges that did understand it and did my explanation was sufficient for them, they really liked it. And so I think I should have maybe dropped another one of my responses on one of your less significant points and then fleshed that one out a lot more. Because I think like since the whole nature of the round was talking about pretty much helping the least well off, like that would have been really helpful for me to do.
For sure. And actually, I had not heard that turn before. Basically, what everyone would read was the response to Gillens and Page, because there were 4 papers written. It was their original paper, response paper, Gillens and Page rebuttal, and then a 4th one. And normally people would read that, not realizing that my study wasn't Gillens and Page, and then it was really easy to respond to in the app. But yeah, I was definitely happy that you didn't flesh it out that much, because then I was just like, of course they have influence, move on. So it did work out for me, because I did not have time in the app rebuttal, because you hit everything on the flow, and yeah, the app has a ton of content, and your own constructive was pretty flushed out, so I did not have time.
That was like my strategy as neg for like the entire tournament, was just like, just dump as much as you can on the app. My coach was like, you probably shouldn't do that in the final, like the final judges don't really like that, but I was like, it worked, it got me this far, and then it didn't work out in finals, but
all good. I was doing the exact same thing throughout rounds. Yeah. Anytime I was neg, I was like, here are 5 cards on contention 1.
Okay. And really quickly, I would like to add, on both sides, there's a lot of good examples from other countries, and I think that's really, really good. And both sides had that, so I think it really added a lot to the cases.
All right.
Can everyone still hear me okay? Excellent. The order is going to be negative, affirmative. Here we go. First on the framework debate, prefer equality. If not everyone has equal opportunity, a just society cannot be met. On this idea of government legitimacy, my opponent says the consent of the governed is necessary. Cross-apply contention 2 here. The wealthy are using their disproportionate influence to silence voices of the minorities and erode consent of the governed. On her first contention, on entrepreneurship, couple of responses. First, white wealth accumulation is killing community businesses. Barrington 11 writes that within 2 years of Walmart opening its doors, 82 local stores went out of business, increasing employment in the surrounding community. Additionally, white wealth accumulation has also killed minority businesses significantly with lobbying. Adam 17 writes that up until 1982, we see that antitrust laws were enforced in a way to protect businesses and independent communities. However, after the wealth of the Waltons, the Tokes, and the Marses increased exponentially, things changed dramatically. Between 1998 and 1999, Black-owned businesses businesses declined significantly, with Black insurance agencies decreasing by 68% and Black bankers decreasing by 23%. Therefore, this idea of barriers to entry is actually best seen in white political influence. Since the wealthy are able to politically influence their way into society, they can ruin minority businesses. Therefore, this idea of minority innovation spurring is actually not true. When Walmart controls a single town, it is not going to increase job creation. This is Rex Michaelis for Soder, this idea of job creation and economic stability. You can cross-play those two cards there too. First, additionally, Bruning 14 writes that unequal societies grow far more slowly. Therefore, this idea of economic stability actually flows affirmative. My opponent says that if people think that elites are not having influence, this strengthens trust in democracy. However, as I articulate to you, because white wealth is growing so much faster than Black wealth, white businesses will continue to crush Black entrepreneurial activities, crushing trust in democracy. On this third idea of promoting political freedom and open competition, the antitrust laws I cite to you specifically say that open competition no longer exists for Black minorities. Additionally, the wealthy influence in politics disproportionately crushes their activity. Therefore, all three voting issues go on to be affirmative. Now into my case. First, on this idea that equality can exist within democracy. First of all, equality forms the basis of the democratic principles. If equality doesn't exist, government legitimacy is gone. She said the equality of opportunity can't be met, but we still must strive for this. If the negative increases inequality of opportunity, we have to affirm. On my criterion, she critiques Rawls. However, there's a problem with this. First, Shea 20 writes that Rawls writes in his requirement that there is a fair value of political liberties or political equality, i.e. if inheritances decrease political equality, Rawls would say that is an unjust system. She says there's no weighing mechanism. It's just a world that is more just under Rawlsian terms. She says that we're not actually going to make this. However, this doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for these ideals. Without striving for them, structural violence will simply continue. On the overview, she says I need to prove as a general principle it's bad. What we're seeing in the status quo is that intergenerational wealth accumulation increases the racial wealth gap and exacerbates political influence of the wealthy. On her first point, she says Scandinavian countries are fine. They have more progressive taxation than us, which flows them to the affirmative. She talks about Kenya. However, Oxfam 20 writes that Kenya has some of the worst inequality in the world, suggesting that intergenerational transfers are not making it more egalitarian. She says the rich have no more influence than the poor. However, Gillen's on page 16 writes that the rich have an effective veto power over politics, proving that they do. On South Korea, she says it's not a current issue. The Chaebol are still around. They are still contributing to political corruption. Additionally, on her judicial point, they have been committed a fraud and not been prosecuted by the judicial system. South Korea is corrupt. On contention 2, she says that 78% of rich people vote liberally. However, she denies the fact that the most of billionaires actually vote conservative. Because their influence and income gives them way more influence, their state matters more. She says the inheritance estate tax isn't wanted. However, Sheffield 19 writes that the majority of Americans actually support it. The reason it isn't passed is because of wealthy influence. On Nigeria, she said that's terrorism. That's a complete non-response. On contention 3, first, Dabler and Norris 15 writes that wealth inequality matters more than income for the racial wealth gap. Additionally, on her point about Germany has one of the worst social inequalities in the world, especially for minority Americans. Finally, on this idea of wealth dynasties, Mim 18 writes that wealth dynasties actually exist for 13 generations, meaning this idea that Black people acquire wealth at a faster rate assumes that intergenerational wealth accumulation is an equalizing factor, and the third contention clearly shows that it's not.
Okay. One of the things that I just didn't have time to do, and I really wanted to flesh it out better, was like the idea of relative wealth inequality. It came up in basically all of my rounds on the negative, because there is a argument to be made that if you are poorer and you're getting an inheritance, as a percentage of your wealth, it is going to matter more for you. And one of the things that I always tried to articulate to people was like, okay, if Black wealth starts at like, let's say $50,000, and white wealth starts at like $1.5 million, and Black wealth increases by 20% and white wealth increases by 10%, as an aggregate, white wealth is still going to be increasing more, even though relatively it is technically Black wealth is increasing at a faster rate. And I didn't explain that well in most of my rounds. And one of the things that I wanted to do was push for that more on cross, and then also bring it back to this speech. And what I think I should have done was either not talk as much about the generational wealth, or just say 3 generations still means 90 years, and therefore it's still going to have influence in the status quo, and then explain relative wealth inequality. I think that's definitely the one thing that I should have done better. The other thing I do in this speech, just because I'm pressed for time, is I don't really explain each individual card. Like, there's not an analytic after the card like there was in the first negative speech. And I think had I grouped and dumped things a little bit better, like the examples that she gives when she responds to me, had those examples been grouped together as a whole, responded to with one card, and then given an analytic, I think it would have made this speech a lot less choppy and more easy to follow for judges.
I thought you covered everything on the flow really well. Like I was definitely hoping you drop more, but because there wasn't that much stuff that you dropped, and I didn't have I had some stuff to extend, but like I thought you did a really good job of picking. Obviously, you weren't going to be able to get to every single thing that I said, and so I thought you definitely did a good job of like picking which things to address. And then I think that this is where that like turn comes into play, as if I had articulated that better in my 1NR, then I could have made a much more clean extension of that into the 2NR, like through the 2NR, which I think would have been really powerful. But since it wasn't really articulated in the 1NR, and my 2NR ended up being a very messy way for me to end the round, that point, which started off as a good idea, didn't really end up having that big of an impact of the round.
Going over an overview of the round,
Oh gosh.
framework, AC, NC, key voters. If everyone's ready. Starting off with an overview of the round, remember my opponent's burden is to prove that intergenerational accumulation of wealth as a general principle is a bad thing. That means she also has to prove that it is unjust for the poor to receive inheritances after their parents pass. Remember that that is a burden that she agreed to in the last speech, which means that if she doesn't meet that burden, even if she can prove that the rich are getting richer, if she can't prove that it's unjust for the poor to receive inheritance too, she is not able to create a blanket statement of intergenerational accumulation of wealth being antithetical to democracy. Let's go to framework. With her value of equality, she just says that it forms the basis of democratic principles. However, she doesn't respond to my attack. We can have an equal society that's not necessarily a good society. Remember, if all citizens are deprived of their rights, but they're all deprived equally, technically we'd be meeting her value criterion, but that's obviously not a world that we want to live in. Against value of justice, she said we need equal opportunity first. I already showed you why we can't look to that. Against my value criterion of promoting governmental legitimacy, she just says consent of the government is necessary, and to cross-apply her second contention, this isn't really a framework level argument. And in her second contention, she dropped a lot of stuff, which I'll get to on the contention level. With her value criterion of John Rawls' theory of justice, she defends my assertion that Rawls specifically says inheritances don't harm the least well off by saying, well, he talks about like in his original principle, he talks about helping the least well off. However, I show you that in his update, which is from the 21st century, so it's based on current societal conditions, he says that intergenerational accumulation of wealth is not necessarily antithetical to helping the poor and helping the least well off. Against her no weighing mechanism argument, she just said it's helping the least well off. That's not a real weighing mechanism, especially since with my third response, she never actually responded to, we have no way of actually determining who the least well off is in society. It's extremely vague. I gave you that example in cross-examination. She never actually responded. With my fourth response about how there's no bright line as to how far we can go to protect the least advantage, again, it went completely dropped. So let's go to her contention level arguments. With her contention 1, she talks about political influence. I brought up Scandinavian countries in my last speech. However, she said Scandinavian countries have progressive taxes which make them flow out. Having progressive taxes does not make a country flow out. We can have progressive taxes in the negative world as well. All I'm saying is that Scandinavia has unrestricted intergenerational accumulation of wealth, and their Scandinavian countries are the most egalitarian in the world. That right there is a reason to vote for the negative, because I'm showing you that there are countries that have all of this intergenerational accumulation of wealth and have very low inequality. She says that against my Kenya response that Kenya isn't a good democracy. However, she's completely missing the point here. My point is that Kenya would probably be a worse democracy if we didn't have the intergenerational accumulation of wealth, because the intergenerational accumulation of wealth allows wealth transfers to go to the poor, lifting 20% of those in poverty out of poverty. Under both of our frameworks, that is a really big deal, and that lifting 20% out of poverty point went dropped. She also dropped the turn I made on this contention. This is huge. I told you that political influence is actually going to decrease in political corruption is actually going to increase in her world, because when the government labels intergenerational wealth accumulation as illegitimate, there's an incentive for the rich to exert their influence in other spheres. If the rich can't directly give cash to their offspring, they're more likely to buy off politicians to create policies that help their offspring. So you can go ahead and turn this entire thing. With her she also dropped what I said about how politicians don't necessarily just look to the wealthy because they want to be reelected. So let's go on to her contention 2 about democratic opposition. She says most billionaires are conservative. However, remember my min post example that says most of the wealth with about half of the wealthy are liberal and half of the wealthy are conservative, so it's a pretty even split. And she talks about all this corruption, but remember, that's an issue with unrestricted lobbying, not necessarily intergenerational wealth accumulation. And she drops that only one third of Americans want any limits on inheritance. That right there is a reason to vote for the negative under my framework, because under promoting governmental legitimacy, which she didn't really contest, we have to do what the people want, and the people clearly do not want a limit on inheritances. With her contention 3 subpoint A about the racial wealth gap, she drops Savoy 19. I tell you that African Americans since 2007 have been accumulating wealth at a faster rate than whites. So go ahead and extend that through. The best way to decrease the racial wealth gap is to allow these wealthy African Americans to pass down their wealth. And against her bright dynasties, she dropped the fact that that over multiple generations, over 90% of wealthy people's inheritance is lost after the third generation. Remember, that's because the wealthy often don't know how to spend that money if they didn't earn it, whereas when that money goes to the poor, it's actually helping them. Let's go to my side of the flow. Against entrepreneurship, she talks about white wealth accumulation. However, she dropped that minorities are actually increasing their wealth faster than whites. So that is going to be my first key voting issue, which is that of the racial wealth gap, because I show you that when we're allowing these minorities to accumulate wealth, we're actually incentivizing them to start these businesses. She talks about Walmart opening. However, that's not an indicative of majority of businesses. Remember, she has to prove general principles, and she talks about wealthy taking down minority businesses. Again, I already told you why that's false, because we have these minority entrepreneurs who are doing really well for themselves. She also completely dropped family businesses, so go ahead and extend that through. That means that at the end of the day, we are going to be increasing job creation and promoting political freedoms, thereby reducing poverty. Which brings me to my next key voting issue, which is that of poverty. I show you that poverty decreases in the negative world for a couple of reasons. One, when we have these direct transfers that go to the poor, we can see that it directly lifts them out of poverty. Remember the Kenya example. This has empirically happened before. Two, we're actually increasing the political influence of the poor when we're not allowing the wealthy to corrupt the government. Remember the turn I made about how when we don't have intergenerational accumulation of wealth, the wealthy are more likely to corrupt politicians. That way their kids can have still have advantages even after they die. So those are two reasons that when completely dropped by my opponent, why the intergenerational accumulation of wealth is not antithetical to democracy, thus I negate.
All right, I'll take remaining prep.
So this was definitely like one of the messiest speeches I gave during the tournament. And I think that a lot of that stemmed from the fact that my flow was a disaster. Like, it was so messy and there was so much going on there. And then it led to me being like very disorganized throughout the speech. And then like I was stuttering a lot. And yeah, so definitely not an ideal way to end my debate career. Not my favorite speech I've ever given to be my last speech. But I think another issue is my word economy. And I didn't really realize this until just watching this back now. I just spend a lot of time repeating the same ideas over and over again that didn't really need to be repeated when I could have fleshed out other ideas more. And I took a long time to say things that could have been said much more concisely. And that put me in a time crunch, and then I didn't have that much time for my key voting issues. And then that caused me to try to address them earlier on in the round. And it was just kind of very messy and disorganized. So that was probably the issue with that speech.
I do think, though, that it was definitely good picking up on the drops. I did drop some stuff, especially coming out of the framework debate, that I was just kind of equality, great, cool, and moved on. And I think definitely capitalizing on that did help, because when I looked at the ballots from this round, there were some judges who did vote for you on framework, because I really don't touch it in my affirmative rebuttal. There isn't time, and I focus really heavily on the contention debate. And for some judges that did work because it was a real world impact kind of thing, but definitely the ones who like philosophy did not like me. The one thing that I think you did also really well too was trying to turn the racial wealth gap. I do something really similar in my negative, because our negatives are fairly similar. And I think really focusing on the fact that, wealth accumulation, just as a general principle, does not have to be inherently bad. The problem is, though, fleshing out whether or not that's actually happening in the status quo. And I think that's really the conflict that the affirmative and negative has, because the negative is listen, as a general principle, the AF doesn't meet this burden that we both agree to in the round, which is accurate. And the affirmative is, no, that's not what's actually happening in the status quo. It theoretically can be good. And that debate, I think, does get fleshed out, especially in final voters, when looking at your voters and also looking at mine. Definitely, I do like the entrepreneurship contention coming out of the negative rebuttal, and I like it being last because I think it connects really well with your final voters, since your voters are poverty and also helping minority communities, which is through the framework. So I think that was a really smart way of organizing it and putting it at the end, because normally what I do is I just go down the flow in order. So I would have done the neg and then the aff, but then it would have made it a lot harder for me to connect back to my voters in the end. So I think you made a good choice switching those two.
The order is going to be negative, affirmative, final voter. Is everyone ready? Excellent. First on the neg, my opponent says that something can be equal but still bad. However, I articulate to you that equality is the basis of justice. On the criterion, she completely ignores the turn I make on contention 2, which says the wealthy are using their disproportionate influence to harm government legitimacy. There's no way she can win on the framework. On contention 2, she says minority wealth is increasing. Simply cross-apply contention 3. That's not true. Moreover, you can extend the discussion we had on cross-examination, which says that absolute inequality for minorities is increasing, even if relative is decreasing. In my opponent's world, black wealth going from 56,000 to 63,000, but white wealth going from 7.2 million to 7.6 million is just because black people are supposedly increasing social mobility. However, all relative wealth inequality shows you is how disproportionately poor black people are. She completely non-responds to my Walmart contention. Even if you don't buy it's only a Walmart specific, my Adam 17 card I read is relative to all white businesses, and she completely drops that. She says that I drop family businesses. However, Walmart is a family business, and therefore it does apply. She says poverty decreases in the negative world. However, she's completely non-responsive to my Kenya example, which says that Kenya has the most extreme wealth inequality in the African world, suggesting that my opponent's policies of equitable wealth distribution simply aren't actually working. She says that we can decrease political influence if you have intergenerational wealth. However, considering that my contentions show you that intergenerational wealth disproportionately goes to those who are already white and already wealthy, political influence will still compound. Now onto my side of the flow. She says inheritances make things more equal. However, you can cross-apply the contentions I give you that show that inheritances go specifically to the rich, wealthy families. That's my Brunig 14 card in the first contention. Moreover, you can cross-apply the responses I give you on relative inequality. She can't show you that inheritances actually make things more fair for minorities, nor does it actually decrease wealthy political influence. On my contention 1, she makes a very serious concession. She drops this idea of the veto power that wealthy have, i.e. if she's proving to you that political influence somehow doesn't happen, she needs to compound with this veto power argument. On contention 2, she says I drop this idea of the estate tax. I respond to that specifically with this idea of progressive taxation. That's my Sheffield 19 card. On contention 2, she also drops my card about billionaires. Considering that more wealth gives you more voice in politics, billionaires are going to have a disproportionate influence. On contention 3, she says black people are accumulating more wealth. That's empirically not true with my contentions. She says I dropped the dynasty argument. However, I respond to it, saying that dynasties actually exist for about 13 generations, getting my opponent empirically wrong. She also drops the argument I make about income, saying that wealth inequality drives all income inequality. But now into final voters. The first is black capital accumulation. My opponent doesn't provide you an actual example of black capital accumulation increasing in the status quo. What we see is that intergenerational wealth accumulation gives the wealthy disproportionate political influence to crush minority business. Her only piece of offense is black wealth accumulation through entrepreneurship, which is not happening in the status quo because of the reds. Second, she tries to tell you that intergenerational wealth accumulation is good. However, she concedes on cross-examination that absolute inequality between black and white families is increasing. Under my opponent's world, it takes 228 years to close the racial wealth gap. In a society that values justice or equality, whichever framework you want to look at, that is simply not just for the African American community. Good round.
Okay, so one of the things, and I didn't realize that I explained it so poorly until I watched this back, I explained relative wealth inequality so badly. I think what I needed to do was give the number examples and say, like, this is an increase in wealth of 20%. This is an increase in wealth of like 10%, and be like, listen, the percentage is increasing. This is true, but relative wealth inequality doesn't show you the absolute aggregate. And I did a very bad job of explaining that, and I'm realizing this now. Because I think one of the things that really becomes a point of clash for the two debaters is the affirmative is really focused on absolute wealth inequality. They're telling you how much inheritance the top 1% is getting versus the bottom 99%, and versus this narrative of the wealth matters more when it's transferred to someone who is disproportionately poor. So relative wealth inequality is what we should be looking at. And I think had I explained it a little bit better, that would have been a lot clearer to some of the other judges. The other thing that I do is it's another pretty choppy speech, mostly because when I do final voters just as an affirmative debater, I don't like to do just an overview because it gets dangerous with like potentially dropping some things that come out of the neg's last speech. And I think if I had gone a little bit faster maybe, or at least just been more concise on the contention level debate, I could have fleshed out some of my responses. So it was not just, hey, she dropped this card, but like, hey, she dropped this card, here's why it matters, and here's the analytic that connects back to my final voters. Because one of the things I was trying to do in the tournament was kind of connect it back to a central narrative. And I don't think I did as good of a job in this round just because there were so many things that the negative talked about that I also wanted to address.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was obviously a really strong last speech. I did. It's fun. I muted all of the 2ARs when I was neg, when I was at nationals. But I did hear I had to watch this round back when I was coaching at a debate camp, and so I had to watch it back. So this is the second time that I've heard your final speech, and it was definitely a good speech. I didn't listen to it when we were actually debating, but it was definitely powerful, and I think you definitely hit everything you needed to, obviously. And the relative wealth inequality point is really good. Like in cross, I had no idea what to say to that. So like that was it was definitely strong. And I think like, I'm sure that if some of the judges had heard it earlier in the tournament, and they probably did hear it earlier in the tournament, then like the fact that you didn't necessarily flesh it out as much as you would have liked to, it wouldn't have mattered as much, just because like they know what you're talking about. Like they hear it and they're like, okay, yeah, I've heard that before, I understand. So I think they all like got what you were trying to say.
Yeah, I thought it was a really good round. Obviously, it's the final round of NSDA, and I think that your guys' analysis is also really good and it's going to help a lot of people. It was interesting to kind of hear some stuff like background that you wouldn't know by just watching the round right off, you know? So it was really, really interesting. So thank you both for helping out by doing this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. It was really fun.